jumped in the bay porter. Long ball porter. Come on, Nunez.
Yeah, okay. Yes, let's see this. Yes.
Give him a hot
Whoa!
You call that pitching? He's in baseball. Not tennis.
Give him a tennis racket.
Give me something to hit.
All right, Em. This is my heater. I dare you to hit it.
You'll be sorry.
Want the heater? I'll give it to you.
That's how you do it, Mom.
Ham, idiot. Now he can't play no more.
Great, you
Idiot. It was a heater.
Stupid idiot.
Blow it outside. Just like I like it.
I remember when losing the ball was the worst. The end of the world, the deepest gloom to darken the joy of my baseball-packed summer afternoon. No ball? What? How would I ever recover? Would I ever experience true joy again without that sweet ball in my leather glove or feeling it ricochet off of my bat? Now Roland experiences this deep gloom of loss dramatically. Every time I launch the ball over the fence at my in-laws, displaying my incredible prowess with a giant plastic bat and a white plastic ball. I celebrate my awesomeness by trotting around the bases while Roland cries and complains and throws his glove at me. It's like he doesn't even understand how game is supposed to work. It's like I ruined his fun. I don't know what that's about. But there have been moments like this for me, where the world came crashing down and gloom descended. I remember the joy of riding my bike down a roller coaster hill of a street as a kid. Feeling the wind in my hair, the speed of the bike, the hypnotic nature of the spokes spinning in the wheels, and then riding right into the tailgate of the parked truck and knocking myself out. The lights went out literally. It was not great. I remember my dad telling us we were moving away from Glendale Heights to Wheaton the summer before I entered 5th grade. Moving away from my friends from school, from the Little League, where I had a reputation as a good player. My world was ending. And then showing up in Wheaton, not knowing anyone, being so nervous at my baseball tryouts that I wet myself in the gym. This is true. I don't make these things up. Spending a summer being passed from family to family while my mom was pregnant in an inpatient psychiatric ward. It was a gloomy season. I remember finally feeling a part of things in our new town and being excited about my future in high school sports after winning the starting running back job for the football team. Then on the first play of the first football game of my freshman year, a linebacker stuck his helmet in my knee as I went around the end with the football. And I dreamed, because I was a young boy, I had dreamed about a future in professional sports, or maybe at least a scholarship to play in college. But then the doctor told me I needed knee surgery, and my dreams of ever being an athlete, which were marginal at best to start with, were shattered. Maybe not the worst moments, right? But when you're a kid, these moments feel like it's the end of the world. Life was no longer as it was meant to be. The end had come. Gloom had descended on my life, as if the universe didn't care about my happiness or dreams. Sometimes it was minor. Sometimes it was life-altering. I remember the night I discovered my wife had been having a year-long affair and was planning on moving out. I was fixing her school computer, and she left her email open in one of the browser tabs. And apparently she'd been emailing about apartments. And I was immediately baffled. We had a house that we shared together with 2 dogs. Like, why? Then I went cold. And I tried to ignore it because she was already in bed, but I couldn't, so I walked into the bedroom and asked if she was looking for another place to live, because she already has a place to live. And at first she didn't want to talk to me, but then 20 minutes later she came out and read a letter that her therapist had encouraged her to write to me. Now I had hoped that she would go to therapy for a while, And apparently she decided that figuring out how to divorce me was the perfect time to actually get there. Her letter wasn't done, but it was enough. Her affair had taught her what true love really was, and that she had not loved me in quite a long time. And I saw my dreams of a future crumble, and I realized who I thought she was didn't match reality, and I had been deeply deceived for a long time. And I was trapped in gloom. I couldn't eat. It was hard to sleep. I wanted to vomit all the time. I lost 30 pounds because I was so emotionally distraught. And I hoped that I could do something, that I could apologize enough, that I could change myself, love her unconditionally enough, win her back, let our repaired marriage be a testament to the grace of God. But there was nothing I could do. It was over, and I'd been a fool. Now, you may not have experienced something like that exactly, but I know that you have been surrounded by gloom before. It's when life no longer makes sense and it's not what you think it should be. It's when your dreams are shattered, when you failed spectacularly and publicly. It's when you hear the diagnosis, when you get the call that someone has died unexpectedly. It's when anxiety and depression hit again. It's when the world seems to have gone mad, or you've gone mad and you've hurt your friends, your spouse, your kids. We will all face times of gloom. And the question isn't how to avoid it. It would be awesome if that was like something we could do, because gloom is coming. And this is life, and there is no life without periods of gloom. The question is not how to avoid it. The question is actually how do we live well amidst the gloom? What should we be doing when we face life's challenges and pains? And the Bible has real guidance for us here. The people of God have gone through times of gloom again and again. And one of those stories is the touch point for the people of Israel. Slavery and then salvation in Egypt. But long before salvation has come, slavery is where it starts. Long before we arrive at glory, we start in gloom. And that's what this whole series is about. The journey of the people of God from gloom to glory in Exodus. Now, things weren't always terrible in Exodus, in Egypt. In fact, Egypt was the setting for Joseph's great triumph, right? This arrogant and foolish young man, who was his father, Jacob's favorite son, was sold into slavery by his brothers. He lost his family, his home, his culture, his language, his freedom, and his future, all in one day. As if that wasn't enough, it doesn't get much better, right? In Egypt, after gaining the trust of his master Potiphar, he was falsely accused of sexual assault by his master's wife and thrown into prison where he remained for years. Joseph knew gloom. But glory often comes from gloom, and it did in Joseph's life. Instead of bitterness and brokenness, Joseph's character was forged and dependence on God was solidified during this period of gloom. And when he miraculously explains the meaning of a dream, he is not only released from prison, but eventually rises to the second most powerful position in Egypt. He wisely manages the resources of the country so that not only does Egypt survive, but they have enough materials to sell to surrounding peoples and nations. People like his brothers who sold him into slavery long ago. Joseph had all the power. And when his family arrived looking for food, he could have taken revenge. He could have helped a little, but not revealed himself. Instead, he chose not only reconciliation, but blessing. In his position of power, Joseph took the blessing that God had lavished on him and blessed not only all of Egypt through his leadership, but his family as well, inviting them into the abundance that he had available. And this is where Exodus begins. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. So Jacob and his whole family moved to Egypt and lived there long enough for the people of God to multiply and prosper. The 12 tribes of Israel are all traced from the line of Jacob and his 12 sons listed here. So we're seeing the birth of a nation, and everything looks good initially. They're enjoying the abundance of the land of Egypt. Joseph's story went from gloom to glory. But in the Bible, this cycle repeats again and again and again, and gloom was coming. They lived in Egypt long enough to not only become powerful and numerous, but for Joseph's legacy and wisdom to be forgotten. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." Side note, it seems like there's some assumptions that this new king needed to check. Like, are these people with us? No, they're not. I just feel threatened, right? Okay. Continuing on. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. Gloom had come. What had once been a land of blessing and God's miraculous provision for his people was now the land of bitterness and oppression. But the story doesn't end in gloom, right? We know Joseph's story didn't end in gloom. Neither does this one, and neither will yours. Because God is always at work behind the scenes. Salvation is coming, even when things look incredibly dark. Far worse than anything I've experienced. And this wasn't even the worst of it, right? To add to the oppression of slavery, Pharaoh orders children to be killed. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. So here Pharaoh doesn't order his soldiers to seek out and kill boy babies. No, he puts it on the Hebrew midwives. They're already in a tough position, and the Pharaoh just made their lives worse. They're supposed to kill beautiful newborn babies. But they're midwives. Their life's work is to help bring life into the world, not more death and pain. Now, interestingly, in the first 2 chapters of Exodus, we don't get many people's names. But these midwives are named in the story, Shiphrah and Puah. And I don't know anybody, we do like Bible trivia that remembers the names of the midwives, but maybe we should. The Bible doesn't include names for no reason. They were noteworthy. Their names are recorded for all the world to know and to remember. Why? Because Shiphrah and Puah were heroes and wonderful women to honor on Mother's Day. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" The midwives replied, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are more vigorous. And they have their babies so quickly, we just cannot get there in time." Which I think is hilarious. But where did he go? So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Shiphrah and Puah didn't follow the evil orders of a man who could have made their lives miserable or even had them killed. In the face of a terrible choice, they chose life and God's way, and they were blessed for it. God gave them families of their own. Perhaps they didn't have children before and were doing everything they could to help other mothers as midwives. Which is a beautiful picture telling the truth that you do not have to have your own children to love other children like a mother. They blessed many women and children. And like I said, I just love their response. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're more vigorous. They have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. That's clearly why this is happening. Now, these Hebrew mothers sound a lot like my wife, Megan. We barely made it to the birth center before Aiden popped out. They had to pull a midwife from an appointment to come and catch him. Her mother and sister didn't make it. She is incredibly vigorous. So, Shiphrah and Puah found a way to follow God in the midst of the gloom. They deserve to be remembered and can help us in our own gloom. In the face of a terrible choice, Shiphrah and Puah chose to act in line with God's character and kingdom. No matter how dark, they didn't abandon life and love. They acted in line with God's will, maintaining a character that is consistent with God's call in their lives and what his kingdom is about, the ever-expanding community of love and grace, peace and justice. Even when there was no peace and justice in their situation, they chose to live lives of peace and justice. And we can do that too. When we experience gloom like Shiphrah and Puah were, we're faced with a choice. Will we continue to live as people of God, or suddenly abandon his ways when things get hard? Jesus was very clear with his followers and with us that we would face hardship and challenge in life. Here's just one example. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Following Jesus and his way of life is not a promise of ease and comfort. In fact, it will often be hard, and life will have its moments of gloom, because life is hard and sometimes tragic, and inevitably it ends in death. But the way of Jesus is better, both now and forever. Following Jesus helps us learn how to live well in the midst of pain, as well as look forward in hope, knowing that God will ultimately make everything new, that justice will reign, that love will win, and he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. I was listening to this great podcast this week called This Cultural Moment. If you listen to podcasts, look it up, you'll enjoy it. It focuses on following Jesus in post-Christian society, and it discussed the experiences of gloom in our world. And the reality they were talking about is that in our progressive Western culture, we have insulated ourselves from pain. Comfort and security are the key and the ultimate goal in life, because the ultimate goal is personal happiness. The problem is, when my life's goal is my personal happiness, I'm left with no greater meaning or purpose in life. Everything just bows to hedonism and what makes me feel good in the moment. Right and wrong are redefined by what makes me feel good and what makes me feel bad. There's no authority beyond my pursuit of happiness. No Bible, no church, no God, no family. And a number of sociologists and psychiatrists have said that this cultural viewpoint, the Western secular worldview, is the least equipped to deal with suffering. Because suffering or pain doesn't do anything for you. It interrupts your pursuit of happiness. It's not good, it's clearly bad. But the way of Jesus tells us that suffering and pain develop character, empathy, wisdom, perseverance, and joy and peace in spite of circumstance. If happiness is the goal, then this no longer has value. Pain and suffering are an interruption to the goal of happiness. And at worst, it's an obstacle for living, because occasionally we experience permanent barriers, like chronic illness or divorce, when things that can never be changed happen. We lose the chance to be happy. Or perhaps, we see this a lot, having achieved everything our culture says makes you happy, we see people turn to despair again and again. Anxiety and depression are off the charts. Suicide is rising. School shootings are frighteningly frequent, as we saw this past week. In a world that is as comfortable as it has ever been, people are startlingly unhappy. Perhaps happiness isn't found in a life lived only for myself. A life focused on happiness makes the very thing we're seeking totally elusive. But the way of Jesus is different. We can act wisely and see the fruits of our wisdom relationally, vocationally, and even financially in some instances. We can give away the love that God has given us and discover that true life is found in service and sacrifice for others, not in a life focused on myself. We can experience peace in spite of circumstance, purpose in the face of hardship, and a community to journey with throughout our lives. Even in the gloom, the way of Jesus is better. So we need to follow the example of Shiphrah and Puah and act in line with God's character and kingdom. Maybe we should remember their names and be inspired by the lives that they lived. Now Pharaoh's plans were initially foiled by Shiphrah and Puah, so he makes his plan public to Egypt in verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave the order to all his people, throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. Now, I can't imagine a world where both my sons would have been killed at birth. As we're expecting our third child, I can't imagine the anxiety of not knowing if the baby was going to be a boy or a girl, and knowing if it was a boy that he would be killed. Historically, we know in cultures that exposed babies with any defect, it was often girls that were left to die and boys that were cherished. In this dark time, we see a total reversal. The gloom was palpable. Things seemed to be getting darker. But God was at work. Even when things seem dark, it doesn't mean that God is absent or silent. In fact, this is often the time that God's plans begin to take shape. So what did the Hebrews do? They lived as best as they could. They resisted like Shiphrah and Puah, and they continued to love and marry and have children. And this is what happened to one such couple in Exodus 2. About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen. So this mother did everything she could do to protect her precious child. And I identify with her. I would like to think that if I'd been in the same situation, I would have done everything possible to protect my boys. Of course she knew the baby was special. Every child is precious. And she did what any mother would try to do, resist the terrible command that would lead to her son's death. But eventually, she did the best to give him a chance at life with a seriously prepared basket, if you look at what she did. And she prayed. Because in this world, in this time of terror, the safest place for you, my child, is in this river. And so I will release you to God and hope and pray that maybe he will be merciful. And I think the Prince of Egypt captures this heartbreaking scene well.
Hush now, my baby, be still, love, don't cry. Sleep as you're rocked by the stream. Sleep and remember my last lullaby. So I'll be with you when you dream. River, oh river, flow gently for me. Such precious cargo you bear. Do you know somewhere he can live free? River, deliver him there.
Hard to imagine. But this child, born into slavery and genocide, was miraculously saved by the daughter of the man who ordered the deaths of his people's baby boys, the Pharaoh who wanted to keep his slave force alive. He was raised in the palace of the man who wanted him dead, at the heart of the empire that was being built at the backs of his people. This is just crazy dysfunction. This is counseling for years. But he was a child and he didn't know how crazy his beginning was. But God was at work, orchestrating things behind the scenes. This baby didn't die. In fact, he was perfectly positioned to be the instrument of God's salvation in the future. He was even nursed by his own mother, What an incredible blessing for the woman who thought this baby was going to be gone, that she would never have experience with him again. This is verse 9. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. You know that we don't get Moses' mother's name, right? We get Shiphrah and Puah. There's a reason there, right? Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses. Moses sounds like a Hebrew term meaning to lift out. For she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." The baby that mother thought was likely gone forever was not only saved, but she had a chance to nurse him and spend time with him before bringing him back into the palace. In this time of gloom, there was a glimmer of joy and hope. But salvation for the people of God was still years and years away. In fact, the story moves very quickly from here, basically, to Moses being a young man. And his story totally derails when he intervenes on behalf of one of his Hebrew people by killing an Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew slave. The next day, Moses intervenes when he sees two Hebrews arguing with each other, and he discovers that his crime had not gone unnoticed, and he flees to the wilderness of Midian. God's chosen instrument wasn't ready to set his people free. So the gloom continues. Exodus 2 says it this way. Years passed, and the king of Egypt died. But the Israelites continued to grow under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cries rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. And that's where our story ends for today. For those living at the time, life seems terrible. It's still surrounded by gloom. How do they respond to the gloom? And how should we? And I've already mentioned the first. Choose to act in line with God's character and kingdom, like Shiphrah and Puah did. Even when everything seems terrible, when gloom surrounds, we can continue to live like God has called us to live, knowing that life in the way of Jesus is better, no matter the circumstance. The second is this: persevere in faith and trust in God's ultimate action. As we see in the story, even when things seem lost, God is still at work. Even if the plan is a long time coming, God is still active. And we see this throughout the Bible. In the story of Joseph, the gloom lasts for a long time before the glory comes. Certainly, this is the story of Exodus that we're exploring. In the book of Judges that we covered 2 summers ago, there's this constant cycle of Israel turning away from God, Israel then experiencing what life is like without God, and then God rescuing his people. Over and over again. In the story of Israel, this is a cycle. Eventually, God sends Israel into exile due to their constant abandoning of God. And then, even in exile, God sends prophets whose constant message is to turn back to God, to remember God, and to trust his work on their behalf. Look and see what happens when we forget him and turn away, they say. This is why we're in exile. But in exile, there's a Daniel, and there's a Nehemiah, and there's an Esther. There are people who remember God and are faithful to him. They persevere in faith and trust in God's ultimate action. It's the same cycle that leads up to the birth of Jesus. There's this period of silence. The prophets quit speaking for God, or God quit speaking to them for 400 years before the birth of Christ. But God is at work. And the Bible is a testament to that over and over again. And in our times of gloom, we can continue to persevere in faith and trust in God's ultimate action, and looking back at this record of faith. But this is not only a cycle that happens in the Bible, this is a cycle that continues in modern history. Consider, many people today imagine that, say, like 1200 AD, when the Catholic Church dominated culture in the West, we kind of imagine that everyone was Christian, right? And that we had this high point in the 1200s, we just progressively followed this line where things just got worse and worse. And it's just not true. Historically, there are cycles of people forgetting God, and they're remembering God, and God showing up in power. There are these revivals, these renewals throughout history. The Reformation in the 1500s and 1600s, for instance. The Great Awakening in the early 1700s. The Second Great Awakening in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The South after the Civil War in the mid to late 1800s. We may not realize that in early America, the South was the most secular, irreligious, unchristian part of America. But after the Civil War, in a time of incredible gloom, it became known for its faith in God. Right now, the growth of the church in the two-thirds world is incredible. Faith in God is not in decline. It's actually in the rise. This cultural moment reports that in the last 10 years, more Persians have become Christians than in the last 10 centuries. Why is that? Well, in 1979, there was an Islamic revolution in Iran, where most Persians lived. Most Persian people in Iran were culturally Muslim, or at least not as conservative or extreme as the Islamic revolution was. And to escape this new oppression and regime, they flee and scatter all over the world. And this was a time of great gloom for them, a time when they're questioning their roots, they're far from home, they've lost a lot of money, and this predominantly Muslim community then starts becoming Christians in huge numbers. Cambodian congregations are springing up from the ashes of Pol Pot's atrocities, both in Cambodia and all around the world. In China, in Africa, in our world today, God is at work powerfully. So when we ask ourselves, will God act in times of gloom? Scripture promises that he will. Both at the end of the age, which is our eternal hope, but throughout biblical history and in modern history as well. Every generation has the potential to forget God or to remember God. And we decide which generation we will be. Will we remember God? Will we act in line with God's character and kingdom? Will we persevere in faith and trust in God's ultimate action? And then the last thing we see the Israelites do is cry out to God for help. In times of gloom, one of the most important things we can do is cry out to God. To give our fears and pain and hurt to him. And this can be incredibly painful and can feel unending, but until we fully grieve, till we face our pain and understand the emotion and loss we're experiencing, it's very challenging to move forward in health, truth, and forgiveness. And God can meet us in our feelings of sadness and anger and pain. If we pay attention to those feelings, we can often learn more about ourselves and about God that can help us move forward and live lives of love in line with his kingdom. And not only can we be honest with God about our own pain, but we can turn to him for help. God shows up again and again in history and in our lives, and he will do it again. And that's the story that we're going to live with this summer. One of the great stories of God transforming gloom to glory. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. So when we face our own times of gloom, let's cry out to God, asking for help, and telling him how we really feel. I remember the first few months after discovering my wife's affair and coming to grips with the end of my first marriage. It was the deepest time of gloom that I've ever experienced. But in that gloom, I wasn't alone. I turned to God over and over again. I gave him my pain and my sadness and anger. I sought forgiveness, and I tried to extend forgiveness every day. This was not a one-time conversation. It was an ongoing daily struggle between me and God, because I didn't have anyone else to struggle with. And he was there with me through it all. I feel like during this period, because if you guys know my story, for a few months my ex-wife asked me not to tell anybody about what was going on. So I didn't tell anybody, which is like the worst advice ever. Don't do that to yourself. So I continued in ministry during the hardest period of my life. I feel like I gave some of the best messages I've ever given in this period of gloom. I was close to God in a way that I don't think I've ever been. And I was giving myself away in service and sacrifice, because my life isn't fulfilled when I pursue my own happiness. But we find the life that is truly life through Christ when we give our lives away just as he's given his life away for us. And I had a wonderful community to walk with during that time that helped me continue to trust God, to persevere, and to choose to live in a way that honors Jesus, even when I was at the end of myself. And if I hadn't gone through that gloom, there's no way I would be where I am today. With a healthy marriage, with an incredible wife, 2 beautiful boys, a new baby on the way, and friends and family I get to share life and joy, as well as pain and challenge with. I am so thankful to God. And I'm so thankful for you. Because gloom is not the end of the story. So when you face your darkest days, when you face the challenges that life will bring to all of us, will you continue to trust in God? That he will work all things for the good of those who love him. that he can make beauty out of brokenness, that he won't waste your pain, but will grow you through it and let you do amazing ministry because of what has happened in your life. Glory is coming. God will act. Gloom does not have the final word in this story. So cry out to God while you trust in him. Persevere and act in accordance with his ways. God heard their groaning and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time.